had an awesome lunch. We're going to talk about a design pattern that we came up with that has helped us a ton with some of the problems we've had with managing our state in Angular. Just out of curiosity, how many people in here use Angular? Great. So for those of you who don't, we're going to do a quick overview on state management in Angular and kind of the journey we've been on. So hopefully we can keep you all caught up with everything you need to know. So about a year ago, we were really frustrated. We thought we were doing everything right. We were managing our state with smart components. We were trying to make our app extensible and reusable. And no matter what we did, our smart components just kept growing and growing and growing and becoming these unmanageable beasts. So we came up with a design pattern. It's called smart directives. It's really helped us to make our code easy to maintain, separate the responsibility for the data that we're showing from the display in the components, and they're super reusable. So I'm Laura King.
I'm Jacob Yacovelli.
And we've been at BTI 360 for 7 years. We at BTI 360 actually host the Dulles Code and Coffee instance. So yeah, so if you're ever interested in learning new things, talking to some awesome people, come out and join us in Herndon. So as I said, we're going to go over a state management recap, but first we're going to do an intro of the app we've implemented this all in. And then we're going to go over our solution of smart directives, what they are and how they can help.
Okay. So for this talk, we're going to go over everything in sort of the context of this demo app that we're calling Taste Trove, a wonderful place to store all your tasty treats. And it has a few things that you'd see in a lot of apps, some sort of table of things, has some interaction. Up here, I have a spotlight that just sort of rotates through a recipe that you have. If you click on a tag, it'll actually take you to a separate page, if it'll do it. Select the tag. It'll take you to a page with recipes that match that tag. And then if you were to click on one, it'll tell you what ingredients you need with checkboxes so that you know what to shop for, as well as instructions on how to make it, and then to add a comment with your comments on the recipe. For this example, we're Gordon Ramsay. I'm going to say, this sucks, because that sounds like something he would say. Okay, so for this whole talk, everything's going to be in the context of sort of this application that we built. And at the very end, there's also a QR code that will link you to this repo so you can sort of see the examples that we've created here. So yeah.
Great. So now we're going to go through the journey we've been on with data management in Angular. So we've been with Angular since the AngularJS days, where we started with services, which are pretty simple and great to use. Once we did our Angular upgrade with React, we implemented our state and stores with NGXS. And then finally, once we realized our stores were bloating our application because we injected them into way too many components, we found the design pattern of smart and dumb components. So starting with services. Services are the simplest way you can do data management in Angular. It's what they recommend out of the box. You read their documentation, and they say, use a service to call the backend. That service will get the data for you, and then use your component to display your information. So they work on a pull system instead of a push system, which means that if you want to update that data, you have to go back to the service and say, hey, get me more data. Where's my data? If you have multiple components linked up to the service, that means that every component has to check for any updates to data, and they could be missing something if you don't do that correctly. So for small applications, pretty simple, pretty great. As you get bigger and you need to update that data in multiple places, this gets a little more complicated to manage. What does that look like in code? We've got our basic boilerplate Angular component information. We've got our constructor, where we're injecting the link to get our data and our service. And then we've got our observable for our recipes, which is directly linked to our data call to fetch our recipes. So in the HTML over here, we can see that we're looping over our recipe list right there and displaying all of our recipes in that component. Then we had the introduction of stores and state. So store in Angular is, and in most front-end frameworks, is an immutable data repository that like everything can talk to. So component A, component B, component C will set up listeners to the store. And the store, whenever it has an update for the data, will broadcast out, hey, I have an update, here's what it is. So this is a push versus the previous pull system, which works really great in making sure that everything is synced up all the time. In addition, it helps with rendering, because that means that your rendering doesn't have to check, do I have an update? Do I need an update? It can just know, oh, there are updates. It also creates a division between the calls for the update and the actual updates that happen. So any of these components can reach out to the store and say, hey, I need an update, or I have an update to this data, and then it will broadcast it out through the existing channels that there was an update. In the code, we've got, again, our basic boilerplate Angular. We've got our constructor. We use a facade design pattern to create separation, again, between our stores and our components, so that you don't have to know the specific internals of the store to make calls to it. You can just call facade, give me the information I need. Then we have a slight difference here. We've got a separation between the data that's going to be returned, our observable for our recipes, and that dispatch we were talking about earlier to fetch our recipes. In our HTML over here, we are in the actual recipe list, and we are looping over our recipes from our data and showing each item. So there's a problem with this, which is the stores are really heavy and they slow down your whole application. And we made the terrible mistake of injecting them everywhere because they update your data asynchronously. You just listen to the updates and it goes with it, and then your app slows down. You can't load anything. So that's where the design pattern of smart components comes in. Smart components interact directly with the store. Inside of them, they'll have what are called DOM components, display components, or presentation components. And their job is just display the data that's given to them, and they are never going to talk to the store. So your smart component is going to handle all of the listeners and all of the dispatches. And then it's just going to pass those data into the DOM components. So what this does is it pulls that store injection way up to the top of your architecture. And since you're not loading it in each component, it makes your packages smaller. The problem we were running into with this is that you want to pull it up as far as possible as you can in your architecture. And that means that you end up with really, really, really large components that are all talking to the store and doing really complicated things. And it was kind of driving us crazy in terms of figuring out what is this component doing, what does it actually need to do, and where is it doing too much. So Jacob's going to go ahead and give us a quick demo of our taste trove application with smart components.
Yes, so smart components, as we said, is the current best standard that we're aware of, that we've sort of built our application with on our project. And like Laura was saying, basically for any component, smart component that has a lot of smaller DOM components that interact with multiple different data stores, it can just grow a lot. For the sake of this talk, though, I made a much simpler application because making a very complex application to demonstrate this would take a long time, but it should still get the point across. So in this repo, I've got a few tags that we can go to sort of show different points, but we're going to start with the smart components example. And I guess for some info about this app, everything's built with Angular 17. We're using new control flow, using Tailwind for our CSS. We're using NGXS as opposed to NGRX for our data store. And we're also using on-push change detection everywhere, and every component is built as a standalone, just for some background with how this thing is built. So the dashboard page is basically where we're going to focus right now. So we have our boilerplate Angular component here, and we set up our observables for the different data we need out of our store. So a value for the spotlight that rotates, the list that shows up in that table, whether or not our data is currently loading, and then also something to be able to display an error if that call was not successful. And down here in the constructor of our smart component is where we actually grab those values out of our store through our facade. All of these selectors are also built as dynamic selectors, so all the values are keyed off of something in our store. So we have to have the link that we use to fetch them to be able to index what recipe list we want from our store. So we see we have a value for our recipe list, our loading, error, and our spotlight. And our spotlight value is actually just built off of our list of recipes that every 5 seconds we'll pick a new one and output that. Then in our template, we'll start with the recipe list. We have inputs for each component that then are piped using the async pipe, the data that component needs. So basically one thing I always like to keep in mind is like, how can we keep components really simple? How can we make sure that they only care about the things that they care about and not any side effects or handling data that other components would need, and build them as simple as possible? It makes it easy to build your components using tools like Storybook and not having to worry about other things that they would affect. So again, this is the smart component architecture and sort of how we should be lining it out given that. But the problem that we were having is as we add more and more dumb or display components in our smart component that have data from multiple other locations or that have data that actually interact with each other, all of this store setup ends up growing and growing and growing and growing and growing. And I think we had a smart component that was about 1,000 lines of dealing with a lot of observable logic. So yeah, we thought there's got to be something better than just adding this over and over and over again, and even duplicating if you have another smart component that uses similar types of data. There's got to be a way we can take this out so that our smart component doesn't have to care about the data, and then also so that the data that we're fetching from the store that might interact with other pieces of data is reusable, that we can just put somewhere else in the application and not have to worry about writing that code again and maintaining it twice. So that's the smart component overview. And I'll go back to Laura.
Before we get into smart directives and kind of what we came up with, we want to see if everybody's tracking. So does anybody have any questions about data management in Angular so far?
So have you considered like macro frontend instead of like managing this way? So like your comment section would be a separate module and your like recipe separate module. So they have each of they have their own store and they completely separated.
Yes, so the question was, have we considered using micro front ends instead of kind of like this monolithic structure that we've ended up in? And we have, and trying to balance the two is really challenging is what we found, right? Because the desire to kind of keep pulling that up and up and up so that you can make it faster and faster and faster is kind of hard to overcome, right? So that is one solution. And this is a design pattern that we've just found helpful in being able to make those decisions and manage that well.
Well, one issue you'd also have if you used micro front ends is still if you're duplicating those same observable blocks in different parts of your micro front end, you'd still have that duplication problem of doing the same selector chain over and over again, even if you broke it up. So anyway, that was a good question, though. Thank you.
Anything else? Cool.
Perfect.
So smart directives. So we have our store, once again, and then what we're calling the page component. So this is the whole page that you're displaying. This is as high as you can go in your hierarchy of components, basically. You're going to have dumb components underneath it still. They're not going to talk to the store. But neither is your page component. Instead, you'll have smart directives that sit in between your page component and your dumb components to talk to the store for those components. Those smart components will have the listeners, and they'll have the outputs. So depending on what functionality you're trying to do, we've been able to break these out by the function they're trying to perform to make them reusable, and so that the components really only have to care about displaying the data in whatever way they want. So Jacob's going to go over once again in our code how we would convert this to smart directives.
Yes. So again, our challenge was to keep our components simple and have them only care about data that they personally care about, or our smart components before didn't actually care about the data that they were fetching. They really just care about laying out all of our dumb components, and they just so happen to need to be the component that fetches the data. So we're going to do that in our code and make it to where our dashboard page here doesn't care about the data, and it just cares about laying out the dashboard. So I'm going to switch over to the simple smart directives tag. I do have a more complicated one that we'll reference in the repo, but we're going to go through a simple case. So you can already see after switching to this tag, our dashboard page basically empty. All it cares about is what components it's trying to display, and then setting the title. Seems like something reasonable that the page would want to do. And you might be saying, well, where did all of our store selectors and actions go? Like, something has to do it. Well, what's doing it now are some directives we created. So we're going to go to a recent recipes directive that is going to handle getting the data out of our state for us. So one kind of magical thing that makes all of this work is when we were looking into what Angular outputs are. Usually you set your output to a new event emitter with a certain type. But if you look at what an event emitter is, it's just a subject, which is just an observable. And your selectors in pretty much all stores are observables. So we were wondering, can you just assign the outputs to the selector? Turns out you can. Pretty great. So that's what we've done. We have our outputs now assigned to just an observable of the value of the selector that we previously had in our smart component. And then in our constructor, we take those outputs and assign them those selector values. And one important thing to note here is that you need to make sure that your outputs observable streams are fully set up before you hit the ng on a init phase, because the outputs need to have that whole pipe ready to go by the time the Angular renderer would be linking all your outputs up to whatever callbacks you have. So if we take a look at how this works when we look at the template, go down to the list here. Here is the selector that we're using for the directive to put it on this component. But now, instead of having inputs like we did before, we actually have these outputs that come from our directive. So when a new value for the recipe list comes in, we actually just have a template variable to get a reference to the component. This is the input for that component, and we just assign it the value from the output. So we're kind of inversing it, where we're letting the outputs drive the data that the component needs to actually display what it is it personally cares about. We have another output for our loading and error. This is pretty much the pattern that we've basically been using. Most components care about the data they want to display. Whether or not they don't have that data yet, or whether or not getting that data was sad. So anyway, so this is basically how you do that. You just take your input and assign it to that event, and every time your store changes, you have it. And the cool thing is, if any other component basically needed the same type of data, just put the same directive on it and do it again. You don't have to write those observable streams again. It's just already canned, ready for you. And you can use it in many pages. We found it really helpful. And because it's just something that provides outputs that can take inputs, you can actually cascade smart directives as well. You can have one smart directive grab a small piece of data for you and take that information and dump it into the input of another smart directive that does other things with it. That maybe combines that with data from another store. Like, actually, Laura, you have a good example of this that we were dealing with search before. Would you like to talk about that a little bit?
Sure, yeah. We have a functionality that allows you to kind of like save off your search. So we have a directive that will do a setup for like a generic search, and then we also have one that will do editing. So the setup and the editing one will actually talk to each other if you want to then save that search, where it'll set it up, output any new changes that you've made, and then the editing one will go ahead and say, okay, here are the edits. And that works really well for us.
It was nice. It actually removed like hundreds of lines of code out of our search smart component. So anyway, there are some things with this that we could improve. I'm not going to go over that in this, but if you wanted to make these smart directives a little bit more generic, one thing we could do, like with this recent recipes directive, is we just injected the link that we used to fetch them. But it'd be kind of nice if this directive just knew how to fetch any recipe list given in a link that was input into it. So that's an improvement we could make, and there's actually an example of it in the dynamic or generic, or is it the generic smart directives tag? So when you reference the repo later, you can see what we did for that. One thing to note that's important with that though is if you have an input that you're using to drive your outputs, basically you want that input to be linked to some observable value so that it can switch map that value to your selector value. So that's one little caveat that's you just have to keep in mind, because that whole output stream needs to be fully set up. Basically, we say put it in the constructor, and that pretty much guarantees that it'll be ready when you need it. But another thing that we could also do, if we looked at this template, we were doing something simple with the recipe spotlight before. You could actually cascade some smart directives by having this one just fetch your recipe list, and then another smart directive that takes that recipe list and just picks one. It's not a great example for this because technically you probably want to use a pipe, but that is something you could do if maybe that value needed to rotate on a value that you fetched from the back end somewhere. So when a simple pipe just wouldn't work, you could do that. But yeah, that's those are simple smart directives. We found them extremely useful. It's simplified a lot of our smart components to not need to care about data anymore and just care about display. So you don't have to freak out when you go in there and be like, who cares about this? Who cares about this? It just really separates who cares about what and put everything that cares about one thing in one place only. But yeah.
Cool. I don't feel like we need to go over this again. I feel like we said it 3 times, but they're easier to maintain. We can separate the data responsibility, and they're reusable. Now, we might be a little naive because we found this solution and it works really well for us, and we're really excited to share it with all of you guys, but we do know that there are some downsides. One of them is that, and this is an issue with Angular in general, is that there's unclear ownerships of inputs and outputs when you're using directives. As you kind of saw in the HTML, everything just looked like an output. It could be coming from a directive. It could be coming from a component. Who knows? We could use a naming convention. We've been toying with that to try to say this is an output from a directive versus this is an output from a component. We haven't really landed on anything yet. Like Jacob said, Jacob didn't say this. ng on changes inconsistently triggers input changes in outputs. ng on changes is a little bit finicky, so it really only listens when you have a reference change, not just the value is changed in your observable. So if you use setters on inputs, that tends to work a little more consistently.
It's also my preference personally. I'm not a big fan of ng on changes.
Then this is what Jacob said. Outputs need to be fully set up before the ng on init. Setting it up in the constructor fixes this. And the outputs that depend on an input need an observable to switch map onto. Lastly, we came up with this, so it's not widely used or battle tested, but we could use some help. If you guys want to try it out, that would be awesome. Here's our QR code for the repo if you want to take a look later. Does anybody have any questions? Yes?
I was curious, did you guys look into using like the host directives property in the component operator?
We could do that, but the idea is that the components don't have to rely on getting data from those smart directives. I did think about that and be like, oh, that'd be kind of cool. But if you can't guarantee that that component is always going to get data from that directive, it'd be better to not include it in there and just tag it on from the template instead. So if you had, for that recipe list, right, we could get that list from multiple different locations. All it cares about is if you give me a list of recipes that are of this type, I know what to do with it. It'd be nice to keep it that simple. Yeah, no problem.
If you want to filter and sort the observable, like type it,
Mm-hmm.
so just do it in the component itself or the directive.
Yeah, so if you wanna filter or sort or do anything, it really depends on your use case, right? If you're gonna use that same filter and sort in other places, right, you might wanna use it in the directive, and then you can just throw that directive on everything you want to be filtered and sorted in that way, and it'll work everywhere. If that's the only place you're gonna filter and sort that data like that, you might just do it in the component in the input.
Yes.
Can you speak a little bit about how this has changed your testing patterns? Because it seems like it might make testing easier to split out the display and the store management code into different.
Yeah, I mean, that does help because when you're looking at one of your spec files, you know whether or not all your tests are dealing with component logic and display logic versus data logic. But we have found that a lot of times, whatever tests you had before in your smart component that dealt with just that data, you can basically just move them over. It doesn't change too much, at least in our experience so far. But again, something we created, we don't know everyone's use case yet. We just know it in our use case so far. But it has made that a little bit clearer in terms of what you're looking at.
Which is great, because large test files are like the bane of my existence. All right, I think we are just about out of time, but if you have any other questions, we're here all day. We're happy to talk about it, or ideas. We love ideas.
Yeah,
So.
we just wanted to share this with you guys because we found it useful. We're hoping at least one person here finds it useful.
Yeah.
But I just wanted to get it out there early. I mean, we're still working through kinks. I mean, how many iterations have we gone through?
3.
Yeah, about 3 iterations of it now. So this is just our current version of it. But yeah, if anyone has any improvement suggestions, definitely willing to hear what ideas you guys have.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you.